Hello, my name is Dominic Ziegler. I write the Economist's Banyan column on Asian affairs. A very warm welcome today to this, the first discussion at the start of the World Ocean Summit's fishing track. And the topic of the discussion now is focused on achieving optimum fisheries management. It's a real pleasure to welcome our panelists today, a highly experienced and distinguished panel. First of all, Andrew Sharpless, Chief Executive of Oceana. Eric Schwaab, who is Head of Oceans and Ecosystems Programs at EDF. Norman Wray, Governor of the Galápagos Islands. And Anna Turrell, who is Head of Environment at Tesco. A very warm welcome to you all. Now, the title of this program, Achieving Optimum Fisheries Management, kind of suggests that there's just a little bit of sort of tweaking at the margins, and then we have near perfect fisheries management. But nothing could be further from the truth. By some studies, just a fifth of 1,300 or so commercial stocks are not overexploited. One of the reasons for that is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. It's very hard to put numbers on the extent of it, but it's wide and may indeed account for something between 20% and 50% of the global catch. It's a staggering amount. Part of the problem is that we don't know the precise scale of it, but we do know that it impacts on countries' economies. It impacts on the livelihoods of millions of artisanal fishermen. That's one of the challenges. Another challenge is fisheries management. And now various regional fisheries management organizations range from the good to the bad and the ugly. We're going to explore how to instill better management. There's, of course, one final area that is significant and important in terms of looking at overfishing, and that is subsidies. We're not going to prioritize global fishing subsidies in this session, not because they're not important. It's a very important topic, but we're going to devote a whole session to that in an upcoming panel. So now, if I could please now turn over to my guests, and perhaps start with you, Andrew. Given the scale of the challenge here in overfishing, one might be tempted to think that this is hopeless, that we can't kind of reverse the tide. So my question to you is, why should we believe that saving the oceans is possible? Why should we believe that turning around fisheries management is possible? And what are the keys, if you believe that it is possible? What are the keys that you can share with us today?
So I am a big optimist on this question. It is practical to rebuild ocean abundance. It's much more practical and achievable than people understand. And the benefits of doing this are also larger than people understand and include, for example, feeding probably 1 billion people a healthy seafood meal around the world every day if you do it right. Why is it more practical than people understand? Well, there are 3 or 4 things. Fishery management comes down to a relatively short list of things, the most important of which is stop overfishing and put in place what are called rebuilding plans. A big study just released in Nature, one of the 2 most distinguished scientific journals in the world, confirms what we've been saying for a long time and what Eric Schwaab actually implemented in the United States when he was a leader at the American agency that manages the American oceans, that the most important thing you can do, and this is in a study of 288 assessed fisheries all over the world, north, south, east, west, continents representing the whole globe, the most important thing you can do that will actually produce a rebuilt ocean is put in place what are called rebuilding plans. What is that? It's very straightforward. It's reduce fishing pressure with a deadline, a short deadline, 5 or 10 years ahead of you, to get back to maximum levels of abundance in the ocean so that the sustainable catch levels can increase. Big study, massive study, 288 assessed fisheries around the world. The most important thing that actually produced rebuilding, not could produce rebuilding, but did produce rebuilding, was rebuilding plans. That's the first big point, confirmed in this big study. Second big point is that more than 90% of the world's fish catch by weight comes from coastal zones that are under the exclusive management of the coastal country. Exclusive economic zones, they're called very helpfully. And so those zones, which produce, as I said, more than 90%, some estimates are 95% of the world's wild fish catch by weight, are managed without the difficulties of international negotiations, without the lowest common denominator process that we tend to see in international negotiations. They're managed by the coastal country, which has under its legal authority, under international law, the ability to set and enforce, rebuilding plans. So for those two reasons, and there are others, we see well-managed countries producing abundance in their oceans in recent periods of time. This is not conceptual, it's not theoretical. Both the United States and Europe and some other countries have done a great job, and Eric will talk about it, in actually putting more fish in the water that then can be eaten by a hungry planet.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, a quick question here before turning to Eric. So you've talked about the power of rebuilding, and you've mentioned a couple of examples. But elsewhere, especially I think for coastal states that you highlight, why the gap? What's holding back a move towards better management?
Well, you have to have a kind of competent government. So if you are a very poor country that does not have the rule of law, and you are subject to corruption, and you are subject, even worse, to kind of pressure from distant water fleets that come into your waters, sometimes illegally, sometimes under various kinds of corrupt agreements, you have a big problem. We see this, so that there's a category of problem called, represented by what we would call the distant water fleets. These are the countries that have boats that sail all over the world and aggressively put pressure on not just the high seas, the international zones, but on the EEZs of poorer, more vulnerable countries. The largest share of that distant water fleet by far is the Chinese fleet, but it's not the only distant water fleet. They have some 17,000 vessels, people estimate, fishing worldwide, many of them subsidized. And you mentioned this, Dominic. The subsidies that these distant water fleets get for their fossil fuel purchases and their operations are a huge problem that allow them to project their fishing pressure into areas where they shouldn't go. And so there is a reasonably straightforward solution to that. You mentioned it. It's going to be a topic at another important panel you're going to lead. But that's, if I wanted to put my finger on one reason, other than you don't have the rule of law in your country, it would be the pressure of the second reason would be the distant water fleet pressure.
And doing away with subsidies would overnight also do away with those dark Chinese fleets that I'm sure will want to hear from Norman about, as the ones that appeared around the Galápagos Islands fishing for squid.
Can I add one other thing? Can I add one other thing, Dominic? I mean, then the third point is just that in the struggle between the bigger industrial parts of the fleet and the smaller artisanal parts of the fleet, the artisanal fishers tending to be more sustainable in their gear, and actually because they're less mobile, more committed to the long-term health of their resource than are the industrial boats, which are both more dangerous with their gear, more destructive with their gear, and more mobile, more able to overfish a place and then go somewhere else. In that struggle over the rules, the sad fact is that the bigger industrial powers have fleet components have more political influence often. So that the policymakers get put in the middle between what's good for the long run, what's good for the smaller fishers, and what's good for the short run and the bigger fisheries. And they need to be people who both have integrity and commitment to science and some political courage.
Well, we will come back to that struggle between, large fleets and artisanal fishermen, and I certainly would like to ask Norman and Anna about that struggle, that tension. But if I could turn now to Eric, first of all, to ask you, do you share Andrew's optimism. In terms of rebuilding stocks, I'd love to ask you to put that challenge in the broader context of climate change. And although, as Andrew has pointed out, individual states can do much that is in their power for dealing with vast global commons issues like climate change. Collective action is also needed. Is there a tension there? How do you see it playing out?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dominic. It's good to be with you today. I'll try to address three parts of your question quickly. The first is I completely agree with Andrew. We have proven that we can rebuild stocks and achieve success, and we can do it fairly quickly. We've done it in the U.S. We've done it in other parts of the world. I would just say briefly that a couple of the elements that need to exist to make that happen is a basic understanding of the science of the status of the stocks, some kind of a management system that ensures that you are managing at a sustainable level and there is some kind of an allocation system that fishers can adhere to. And then finally, obviously, accountability in the system that includes all kinds of components around reporting and enforcement and the like. So much of the developed world has those basic conditions. I think one of the points that Andrew got to around small scale fishers in many of remote parts of the world, a lot of those fisheries are unassessed and not regulated in the way that you see regulation in the EU, in Japan, in the US, in other places. One of the things that we're doing now is working with small scale fishers to help them basically achieve obtain the tools that they need to achieve sustainable management that includes things like understanding of the status of their stocks and appropriate allocation systems. One of the things that EDF has championed for some time is rights-based approaches to fisheries management, both in developed places as well as in the developing world, where as Andrew said, interests of the fishers are aligned with the long-term conservation needs of the stocks themselves. So, moving to your third point, which is probably the looming concern for developed world fisheries and small-scale fisheries alike, and that is climate change. So we are seeing big changes in the ocean, and those changes are having dramatic effects on the productivity and distribution of fishes. And we could probably spend the rest of this session talking about the implications of climate change for various parts of the world and what we need to do about it. But we basically have assessed that you need a couple of conditions to effectively deal with climate change. One is you need that basic sound management capacity. Second, you need to look ahead at the way fish are moving to cooler and deeper waters, affecting productivities in various parts of the globe. And then finally, you have to understand that some projections suggest that upwards of 50% of stocks will cross a new jurisdictional boundary in the coming decades. So even in those places that have relatively stable, sustainable management systems, challenges are arising as fish stocks that are managed in one place move to another place, and now that shared stock has to be managed effectively across multiple jurisdictions. So increased ability to address trans-jurisdictional movement of fish is incredibly important and will be more so in the future. And then finally, issues of equity arise as many of the places that will be most likely to see their productivities decline are in tropical zones. These are places where people are unfortunately most dependent on fish for livelihoods and therefore face the biggest challenges. So again, lots more to say about that, but that's a basic overview of where we stand today and what we face in the future from a challenge perspective with climate.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And you've laid out a broad and important range of topics. And I suspect that a number of them are topics that Norman thinks a lot about in his job as governor of the Galapagos Islands. First of all, transboundary jurisdiction, which will be necessary because, as you say, fish stocks will move with climate change. I mean, that must be of great concern to Ecuador, which has many thousands of fishermen dependent upon healthy seas. So that's one issue I'd like to ask you about, Norman. I'd also like to ask you about that tension that both Andrew and Eric have alluded to between large fleets and small-scale fisheries, because that tension, it seems to me, from this distance, I'm sitting in Hong Kong, was really brought into definition last year when hundreds of Chinese squid boats crowded around the edge of the exclusive economic zone of the Galápagos and started hoovering up squid that presumably had a great impact upon local fishermen. So I'd love to ask you, Norman, about how you see some of the issues that we've already heard about, and do please raise other issues that you haven't yet heard raised that are important to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for this kindly invitation to participate in this panel. I'm not an expert on fishery, but I dealing with all these tensions around the conflicts between the artisanal fleet, the industrial fleet, and also of our own country, and related also with the overseas fleets that are going around in the international waters around our limits of our economic exclusive zone. And what is really important is that we believe that Galápagos is going to be under a big pressure. Right now, it's under a big pressure, but it's going to be under a bigger pressure in the future, for sure. You talk about the impact of climate change. In the IPCC report about the impacts of climate change on the oceans, it's clear that our area in Galápagos, an area of the Eastern and Tropical Pacific, is going to be under a big pressure because incredible, maybe around the condition of their water currents around Galápagos that are strategic for our life and for the stocks and for all the diversity that we have here, for the migratory species and also our endemic species. They are going to be in better conditions than other parts of the ocean in the Pacific. So for sure, the role of Galápagos historically, or being like a spillover effect under the protection that we have in our marine reserve, that it doesn't allow it, or that is forbidding industrial activity inside of it, is strategic, not only for our national fleet, it's strategic for the world. So what we are starting to see is that year by year is going to be a greatest pressure around our stocks and now the migratory species that are around it. So this is one of the reasons because we are trying to discuss what is going to be the management and the possibility of better protection of marine protected areas, maybe a discussion about the possibility to increase the protection around Galápagos in the economic exclusive zone. And after this proposal, we saw all the pressure of our national industry, no, in an alliance, interesting alliance with the artisanal industry inside Galápagos and outside Galápagos in the continental area of Ecuador, having like a political alliance to oppose to any possibility, even to discuss the option of generate a better protection of the marine area around the marine reserve of Galápagos. We have 40 square miles around Galápagos of protected, of marine protected area. And then we have close to 200 miles of protected economic exclusive zone. So the plan is try to see how we can manage also the 200 miles around the protected area of Galápagos. And then we found this incredible, never seen interesting alliance between the artisanal fleet of Galápagos with the artisanal fleet of the continental area, and also at the same time with the industrial fleet of our own country, discussing and trying to stop any option that we can generate about the discussion on how to have a better management at the end. So what I'm trying to say with that is that at the end, we really need to enforce our capacity of regulator and policy from the states, and also reduce the presence of the corporative presence of the industrial interests even inside the regulated system of the state, and also in the international areas of discussion about the regulation around the seas. It's incredible how through the years, maybe it happens in other economic activities, but here in the fisheries sector, you can see that all the time, the presence of even the delegates of the state are closely linked to the industrial fleet. So this is one of the great challenges that we have to face. And the second challenge that we have to face is how we can connect the responsible and more sustainable markets with a definition of how we can organize in a better way the activity around the world. Because you have this black area or gray area that is the international seas. No? Over there, everything can happen. So always, we don't know what is happening with illegal fishing there. We don't know what is happening with the fishery arts. We don't know because it's impossible to have a monitoring and a control of the activity in the international seas of the fleets. And over there is the big opposition to have an international treaty for overseas. And this is one of the big discussions that we have to face. So I think so that if we can work together, trying to find these connections where markets, regulators, and even the industrial fleet understand that we have to discuss is a long plan to save security, or even to the economic activity, but food security for the world. Maybe there's an option that we have to work in the best optimistic way. But I think so that there's really some strong power opponents around the possibility to discuss these options. And at the end, we need that China have to sit in the table to discuss all this stuff too. I think so that if we can find the way to do it, it will be interesting. And yeah, what we saw is that maybe there's an interesting option because China was strategic to support the climate change agreements at the end. After under the administration of Donald Trump, United States decided to get out. And it's interesting to see how China and also Europe will be moving really strategic to support the climate change agreements of Paris, waiting to see what's going to happen in the next government. And right now, maybe it's a really important moment in the global discussion about this issue, so we can find with United States and maybe even China sitting discussing what we have to do with the international treaty in the overseas. So I think so that these are the challenges that we are facing right now.
Well, thank you, Norman. And you gave a very stark sense, at least for me, of how hard it is to get interests aligned. And I guess a number of us had assumed that especially small-scale fishermen had the long-term prosperity of the fisheries close to their hearts. But there are other incentives and dynamics at work, and I hope that in the general discussion towards later on in this panel, towards the end of it, we can look at IUU. We can look at crime that's organized crime that takes place at sea. I know that the Galápagos has an issue of drug running as well, and I wonder whether some of the fishermen are involved in other criminal activities. The question of China and its role, particularly in buying local licenses in Western Africa and elsewhere, is crucial. So let's come back to that, I hope, in a few minutes. But I would, first of all, love to ask Anna about how she looks at the challenges, because, Anna, at Tesco, you have put traceability and sustainability at the heart of your seafood purchasing. And I would love to know how you think it's going, what still needs to be done.
Thanks, Dominic. And really great to be here today. Such an important conversation to be had. You're absolutely right. Marine sustainability is a key strand of our responsible sourcing approach at Tesco, and actually also an important part of the partnership that we have with WWF as well at the moment. So perhaps I'll just kind of scene set a little bit for those that are less familiar with Tesco. So Tesco is the UK's largest retailer, and we also have presence in a number of EU markets as well. So whilst we are certainly by no means the largest buyer of fish and seafood, we like to, as much as possible, kind of punch above our weight and make sure that we're having as much of a positive impact on the industry as we can through our suppliers and our supply chains. Our overarching ambition as a food retailer is to deliver affordable, healthy and sustainable food for all. And to deliver on this ambition, sustainable fish and seafood need to play a really critically important role. Our marine sustainability agenda focuses on three key areas: the health of fish stocks, impacts on non-target species, and the health of the marine ecosystem. To ensure that a healthy marine ecosystem, we want to really build on the successes we've had with certification, and particularly MSC certification, which is a really core tool in our toolbox currently in terms of marine sustainable sourcing. But we want to take it further by aiming for an ecosystem-based approach. And we're really beginning this journey by introducing, actually today, our roadmap for delivering this. It's a roadmap that we've co-developed with WWF and which aligns with their tuna transition strategy. So really focusing on moving from a gear-based to a kind of an ecosystem, seascape-based approach, really. And that's in recognition of a lot of the challenges, actually, that we've already heard a number of the other speakers highlight in this session. As a company, as a retailer, we have absolutely zero tolerance on illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And we're also a signatory of the EJF Charter of Transparency. As much as possible, we promote the use of the PAS 1550 Code of Practice in our supply chains and through our suppliers to help ensure that the seafood that we are sourcing is coming from legal and ethical sources. And we fully support EJF's 10 principles for global transparency in the fishing industry, which are obviously aimed at encouraging governments to promote transparency as a means of ensuring legal, ethical and sustainable fisheries. Now, for us, these act as a great guideline on key actions to take to reduce IUU, amongst other things. But as we've already heard from other speakers about the need for accountability across the system, we also recognise that as individual companies, we kind of can't deliver sustainable fisheries management alone. And that's why we really believe it's critically important for countries to ratify the Port State Measures Agreement as well. So that's a current state of play for Tesco. And maybe just to kind of reflect briefly on a couple of the other panelists' comments regarding the tension between kind of scale, I guess, this issue of scale in terms of industrial sized fleets versus smaller scale fisheries operations. As a retailer, we've certainly found that there's quite a challenge in delivering the kind of the balance, I guess, that you need in terms of ensuring that we are able to meet our commitments and responsibilities to deliver sustainably sourced, responsibly sourced fish and seafood. And that also includes considerations for the working conditions, particularly on more industrialized vessels. We've actually seen some really positive steps taken on some of the industrialized vessels, particularly things like the Spanish tuna fleet, for example. But the flip side is that there's also a number of areas where we know that there's significant concerns and poor working conditions. From a retailer perspective, obviously, we have more leverage the more that we're able to engage through our suppliers and supply chains. And so sometimes having bigger industrialized companies is easier for us to kind of work with, to access and to have influence through. And that's obviously linked to the volumes that we're sourcing. But at the same time, and as we've heard from Norman, I think it's really important to recognize the important role that smaller scale fisheries management systems play, in particular consideration for local benefits, whether that's kind of economics of the system and job security or its revenues back into local communities. So it's very much about finding the balance. But I think that comes through certainly back to this point around the importance of shared accountability, much greater transparency across the system, and then all of us playing our part in terms of delivering on that shared ambition of sustainable kind of fisheries management.
Thank you, Anna. And yes, absolutely, that sense that this is a shared challenge. Andrew, what would you like to jump in there?
Yeah, I want to focus on the question you put before us, Dominic, about illegal fishing, because the reasonable audience member will say, okay, we need to have scientific assessment, we need to have rebuilding plans, we need to have the rule of law. But if there's a fundamental corrupt system here where illegal activity is permitted throughout the world, who are we fooling, right? I mean, I think that's the sharpest version of the question. And I think it's a fair question. I want the audience, and I think that other panelists will agree with me. We've already heard some of these themes. There are three levers against illegal fishing that are quite powerful. Number one, purchasers like Tesco, like Anna is describing, can insist that their suppliers supply fish which are fully traceable back through to a legal activity through the entire supply chain. And Tesco is a perfect example of a buyer of fish that has global influence on the conduct of the fleet. Insist on traceability, insist on proving that your fish, as you're describing doing, Anna, are legally sourced to you. Big lever. Other big purchasers should do the same thing. Second thing, subsidized distant water fleets, as we've discussed, use their subsidies to put a lot of pressure on little countries like the Galápagos. We heard from Norman talking about the fact that last summer, there were 300 Chinese fishing vessels right off his EEZ aggressively taking squid with subsidized boats. How would you stop that? You're going to have another conversation about subsidies, and they could be done through trade agreements. And trade agreements, which are one of the few international agreements where actual enforcement arrangements are in place, could reduce those subsidies. And bilateral and multilateral trade negotiators should require that those subsidies be taken out. Now, the third thing we haven't talked a lot about is just straightforward transparency. Make sure that when, especially the larger boats are fishing, they are doing so in a transparent way where their presence, their fishing activity is monitorable by the public in the world. Now, we, Oceana, together with Google and SkyTruth, launched a now independent NGO called Global Fishing Watch, which uses the satellite information from the locations of fishing vessels around the world, some 75,000 of the world's largest fishing vessels, to publish a near real-time map of their fishing activities. This is a proof of concept that it would be perfectly reasonable for the future world to insist that if you are fishing on the public resource, you are doing so in a way that is trackable and monitorable in near real time or in real time by the satellites of the world. And so the countries of the world and the RFMOs of the world should make it a mandatory requirement that you have a transponder on your vessel, and you have it operating, or you are presumptively doing something suspicious. Just like if you were driving around in your automobile without a license plate on the outside, the police would pull you over and say, there's something wrong here. That kind of transparency is technically feasible. We've proven it through Global Fishing Watch. And what we need is the RFMOs and the countries of the world that have EEZ power to make it a licensing requirement that you will, if you're larger than X, meters long, carry a transponder and be visible. That's a big transformative thing. The famous American Supreme Court justice said, the best sunshine is the best disinfectant. We're talking about deterring illegal activity, right?
That's a very important point. We have only 5 minutes left. I personally would love to hear very briefly from one of you, perhaps Eric, about the scope for electronic monitoring. But beyond transparency at sea, and during the COVID pandemic, the need for other than human types of monitoring aboard fishing vessels has grown. But yet, in the Western and Central Pacific tuna fisheries, the vessels have been excused from having fisheries observers because of COVID-19. But I would, in the remaining few minutes, love to ask or try to draw out one or two of you on whether fisheries crimes should be chased ashore. I mean, the trouble with fisheries inspectors in ports is they have too narrow a purview. Yet a lot of those who are involved in illegal fisheries are involved in not just scooping up more fish than they are allowed to, but in drugs, in money laundering, in so much else. And I'm sure to a lot of vessels, the confiscation of too fine a net is just the cost of doing business. Eric, would you like to respond to that? I know you had your hand up anyway. Please be aware that we have only 3 minutes left, so keep your answers brief.
Thanks. I'll try to do this quickly. So I completely agree that Global Fishing Watch and mandated participation would be a huge step forward. I think, Dominic, to your first point, that alone doesn't tell the whole story of what is happening on the vessels. And so there needs to be also mandatory observer coverage that has been challenged by COVID as well as cost for a long time. And putting electronic monitoring on vessels is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. And then the third piece of that is the shore-based reporting and the kinds of transparency that moves through the market that Anna and others spoke to. So I think if you can put together the remote sensing of an application like Global Fishing Watch, more pervasive use of electronic monitoring on vessels, and more transparency as in what is reported in port, then you will have a system that really gives a whole and much more transparent picture of what's happening out in the ocean, as well as through the marketplace. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Anna, Norman, just 30 seconds views from you both. Anna first, please.
Thanks, Dominic. Yeah, I'd just like to echo what Eric and Andrew have said. We need to see 100% of observer coverage, absolutely, and that needs a combination of electronic and human observers, absolutely fundamental, and that's actually part of the tuna transition plan that we've developed, in terms of delivering on our ambitions to achieve seascape coverage. But what I just want to add, and it's been mentioned by Norman already, is that's got to be complemented by a robust UN High Seas Treaty. It's absolutely essential if we're going to support management efforts beyond jurisdictional waters. So it is a combination of levers, and we need to bring them all to bear. And as industry, we've got an absolutely important role to play in supporting civil society and governments in kind of championing for the change that we need to see.
Thank you, Anna. Norman, last thoughts.
Yeah, I think so. Ecuador right now is inside the Global Ocean Alliance, and I think so that is important to understand what means this objective of creation of more marine protected areas, going to the 30% of them in the 2030. But what is going to mean this in the economic positive impact over the small fishery activity? That's really important for Galápagos. Right now, we are suffering incredible economic crisis as a result of COVID. Our dependence of tourism is incredible, and we are suffering that right now. So, what we need, for example, if we can work with industry like Tesco, for example, to find how we can get a better value for the products that comes from the small fishery activity in Galápagos, that it doesn't use industrial arts of fishery, that will give you a better value for the activity of the people here and for their economy too. For sure, tuna,
sorry to
some wahoo. Sorry, okay. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to find this alliance between the markets and even the regulators and industry to see how we can put better value in the products of our activity right now in places as Galápagos. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Norman, and I'm glad that Tesco and the Galápagos are now in touch with each other. And I can't thank you all enough for this session. We've decided that there is optimism there, that there is a chance to rebuild, but we're under no illusions as to the challenges for that. Transparency, incredibly important. Technology can help. But also crucial is collective action, governments working together, going after crime. And now we've only dipped our toes into this. It's a huge subject, but please, bear in mind that these conversations will continue throughout the course of the World Ocean Summit. And please stay tuned for the next session in the fishing track, which is on the state of fishing subsidies. Andrew, Eric, Norman, and Anna, I can't thank you enough. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this stimulating discussion. All the best.